Hello, I'm Tyler Ball. I'm a PhD student in the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies here at Warwick. I study contemporary Anglophone literatures from the Indian Ocean, and I'm joined today by Abdulrazak Gurnah. He's the Nobel Prize winning author of 10 books, such as Memory of Departure, Admiring Silence, Paradise, and By the Sea, both of which were nominated for the Booker Prize, and his most recent novel, Afterlives. Dr. Gurnah, welcome to Warwick.
Thank you.
The first question, the occasion of your visit today is the annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture, and your talk is entitled Reflections on the Journey Back. The title reminded me of this anecdote that you've told a few times about writing the beginning, the first passage you wrote in Afterlives of Hamza's return, and how that comes much later in the finished novel, after you've sort of contextualized the events for the reader. So my question is, how does the weight of a moment shift when you're situated in a kind of broader timeline? Or maybe what happens to a story when we properly historicize or contextualize?
In this particular case, I started with the idea of writing about someone who had been traumatized by war. I mean, I had in mind, of course, the moment as this historical moment, 1914, 1918. Conflict in what was then called Deutsche Ostafrika. But I wanted the story to be about somebody who comes back from that conflict wounded, and that somehow we would be seeing the process of self-retrieval, that would be the novel, which indeed is how it worked out. So I wrote that passage first because I guess it had been in my mind, that moment of arrival had been in my mind even before I'd come to write it. But then having written it, and I thought, all right, where does he go once he arrives? What's the first thing that would happen? And that he would end up in a certain place, and who would he meet there? And so then in a way, it often happens, I think, in the way I write, is that a moment, and then you think, yeah, but how did we arrive at this moment? And so then the preceding, as it were, comes before this central moment. It doesn't alter it, I don't think, in any way, but it kind of peoples it. It makes it more possible to imagine that such a moment would arrive.
The second question is, you describe moving to England as being a stranger, or maybe being made to feel like a stranger. And I'm curious whether you think there's something sort of revelatory about seeing the world through the eyes of a stranger.
Well, undoubtedly, because unless you're a very well-informed stranger, you're going to be meeting a lot of things you didn't know about, so revelatory in that sense. But also how people see you becomes something that informs. So it's not just a place, it's also learning to decode, to decipher, to understand how you're received. And ultimately, of course, what do you do about that? How do you deal with that? It could be if you're a mature person, well-traveled person, even if you're a stranger, this maybe doesn't matter, you know how to go to the bank, you know how to withdraw money from a machine, you know how to go into a restaurant, etc. But if you're a relatively ignorant 18-year-old, it's a terrifying experience, especially if you don't have one of those things to withdraw money with. So there is something quite alienating about this experience, I think, unless, as I say, you're very well informed, very well traveled. But I think on the whole, most people do find being a stranger alienating, difficult, and if there is hostility, that makes it a lot worse, of course.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that experience has helped you as a writer?
Well, it certainly made me try hard to understand what I've just been describing, try to understand both what it feels like and what it means, etc., but also what it is that I've left. So it forces, I think, that kind of strangeness, or being a stranger, forces both a need and a desire to understand where you are, but also forces a desire to understand what you've left. Because while you live it, you kind of negotiate it rather than think deeply about it. But when you leave, then I think it's a different kind of reflection.
This next question I wanted to ask you for a long time. You know, you read someone's work, and I haven't read all of your work, but much of it, and some of it often, you know, many times. And you start to notice these kind of patterns or these sort of stylistic particularities. And there's this word that you use often. It comes in dozens of times in every novel, perhaps. And you use it to really great effect. It sort of holds open the story to alternate possibilities, right? It doesn't foreclose the sentence. So the question is really just, you know, I'm struck by that ability to keep the narrative open to the possibilities that things will be otherwise than the story that we're hearing. And I wonder whether this openness is kind of important to you as a storyteller or as a writer.
Yes, absolutely important. And I like the sound of perhaps as well. But it's also non-committal. So perhaps it's this. It doesn't deny. It opens the possibility. But it doesn't just open one possibility. You'll notice that I don't just use perhaps once, but a string of perhaps this, perhaps that, perhaps the other. And it's a way, I suppose, of saying, yes, there are multiple outcomes are possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that great interruption where the narrator, Rashid, is trying to imagine the Rihanna and Martin's kind of relationship, and there's just this long string of possibilities, one after the other. So part of the reason I was able to talk to you today is because I'm a student here, and my supervisor, Dr. Varma, she offered me this kind of opportunity, you know, thought this experience would be good for me. And so my question is, you know, about this figure of the student. It appears often in your work. Not just one student, like the individual, but sometimes groups of students, groups of international students, or again, Rashid when he's in London, or Latif at the student hospital in East Germany. These settings or these kind of groupings of students appear over and over. Is there something about that person or that figure that sort of captures your imagination?
Well, partly it's because I know quite a lot about students, and I was one myself, and largely the kind of dislocated, displaced people that I was most familiar with would be people who came to Europe or went to Europe as students. So it's not too far-fetched to imagine that the groups of students mingling. But anyway, it's also, I'm very familiar with that world, with that body of people. I think at some point during writing, I thought, why invent? Why not write about things I know about? Instead of trying to do a lot of research in order to understand a community or a moment or something like that, to use what I know. Not because I want it to be realistic in a sense of being true to certain particular events, but because then I can write plausibly about it rather than try to speak about things I don't fully know about.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of myself and the other students here, my colleagues at Warwick, for taking the time to sit down with me. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you, and thank you.
Thank you.